So yes, just to say, today's Guyana Speaks is Guyanese women at home and abroad, and we're very happy to welcome you here today, Dr. Claudia Thomlinson. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Juanita. And my thanks also to Rod and Guyana Speaks for hosting me on this platform this afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to just start by sharing my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my slides, see my presentation.
We can.
Excellent. I just want that larger. All right. Well, as we've heard in Juanita's introduction, I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about my research, which is published next week, next Thursday, the 3rd of October, by Bloomsbury. And my research is being published as a biography of Jessica Huntley with the title, as you can see, Jessica Huntley's Pan-African Life. And it's based on almost 6 years of research. And during that time, I conducted approximately 50 interviews with participants, associates, authors, artists that Jessica Huntley worked with over 50, 60 years, and also family members and friends. And my research was also conducted in 7 major archives in Britain, but also 2 in Guyana. Um, so my first slide is about, I'm just going to address the title, why Pan-Africanism, why have I described Jessica Huntley as having a Pan-African life? What do we mean by that? And put simply, Pan-Africanism, it's a movement aimed at connecting and unifying all those ideas that promote the uplift of Africa and Africans, and also those in the African diaspora. And that, of course, is in the context of a long history of racialized oppression and exploitation. Hakeem Addy, who supervised this research and supported the research, who's known for his expertise in Pan-Africanism. I do think that his definition of Pan-Africanism is very helpful as a variety of ideas, activities, organizations, and movements, sometimes in concert, resisted the exploitation and oppression of all those of African heritage, opposed and refuted the ideologies of anti-African racism, and celebrated African achievement, history, and the very notion of being African. Okay, so throughout my research and the overarching views that I've adopted based on my research is that although Jessica worked fought and struggled against injustice generally, this idea of Pan-Africanism is an idea that was a golden thread that ran all through her life. And why have I described her as a radical? Which of course can mean many things, but I think it's fine if we just think about this in a fairly uncomplicated way. So it's to mean that she was interested in deep rooted change. So when addressing her struggles and battles, she was not interested in short term temporary fixes. So all of her activities were aimed at achieving deep rooted and systemic change, change that would be seen and felt on an intergenerational basis, not only necessarily addressing issues in the short term. Okay. It's impossible. Those who know the history of Jessica Huntley's life and achievements, it's impossible to summarize her life and achievements on one slide. And many of you will have known her worked with her or just know of her work. But it's this. So this just gives you a brief overview. So she was born in 1927 when Guyana was British Guiana, and she died in 2013. So she was aged 86, and most of her life was spent as an activist, political, cultural, and community organizer. She was brought up in a tenement slum in the heart of Georgetown in the 30s and 40s, and living in a very low income family. Obviously, Georgetown, the whole of Guyana, much of the Caribbean at that time suffered um, from extreme poverty and hardship. And Jessica was was in and her family were in the center of that. She grew up in the background of church. Her mother, well, I'll be talking about in a little more detail the next couple of slides. She was brought up in a single parent family headed by her mother, who was a very staunch Christian and church goer. Um, Jessica was also brought up within trade unions, a strong sense of community, and she also really championed the rights of workers from an early age. And she is known to have called and supported and been nominated to lead a factory worker strike against the exploitative practices that she observed happening there while she was working in a garment factory. She formed many important partnerships, but I think it's fair enough to it's correct to recognise her 65-year partnership with and marriage with Eric Huntley and their family. And Eric Huntley was also a founding member of the People's Progressive Party of Guyana, and Jessica Huntley was also a founding member of that party when in 1953 it became the first nationally elected party, which was very anti-colonial in its stance. And the WPO, the Women's Progressive Organization, was co-founded by Jessica, so she was one of the actual driving forces of that organization, which is still operating today, and that was co-founded with Janet Jagan and other women in 1953. Jessica moved to Britain in 1958, and Britain became her main home after that period of time. And for the remainder of the bullet points, I've just selected the main areas for which she's best known. So she co-founded Bogle Overture Publications, and that operated as a publishing company and as a bookshop in London over a period of 25 years. The bookshop closed in 1990, and in fact, Bogle Overture has continued to publish and to offer a book service years after the bookshop closed. She co-founded the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books with John LaRose, and that was a successful operation for many years. She was the first publisher of Walter Rodney's The Groundings with My Brothers and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And she also published Linton Kwesi Johnson, Lem Sese, Valerie Bloom. In fact, a generation of authors and artists went through the doors of Bogle Overture publications in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and later. She remained a Guyanese activist abroad, and she was um, always involved and interested in campaigning for um, the activities in post-independence Guyana, particularly the what she saw and many of her supporters saw as a very authoritarian government.
She's a Guyanese.
Can you hear me? Yeah, post-independent. And she founded numerous campaigns and organisations in Britain to resist the oppression of Walter Rodney and other radicals that were seeking to uphold the rights of working people in Guyana after the independence period. She was at the forefront, as I've said, of Black and Third World publishing globally, particularly women authors, and also at the forefront of literature and art for Black children during this period. She was an early implementer of Black supplementary schools, and she was known as a street activist against racism, and she became an elder of radical Black activism, called during her era the matriarch of Black activism on a global scale. For the next few slides, I want to read some extracts from my book, and so I'm going to be just thinking first of all about some of Jessica's values and achievements. And in my book, I've actually argued that many of these are grounded in her upbringing, in difficult circumstances in Georgetown in the 30s, where she, as I said, she was brought up by a tenement in a tenement yard. Her mother was Hectorine Carroll, who was known as a local matriarch, and she was a local female leader in her own right, and she provided a pastoral and caring and community service for the community, but also she was particularly focused on looking after and caring for and protecting the women from in the community from abuse. So I'll just read this extract from my book. Jessica described her mother's occupation. She went to work as a domestic, and of course it was Portuguese people who could afford to hire. And this woman, she said, used to leave her bracelets and earrings all around the house as a way of testing to see if she were honest. That's testing to see if Jessica's mother was honest. According to her daughter, Hectorine eventually became enraged by these constant tests of her integrity. And one day she verbally upbraided this employer and walked out of the job, even though she had no other regular income to buy food for her children. A young, hungry Jessica learned from her mother's explanation why she had left her job, that there were principles in life to be considered more important than personal comforts, including food. It's unlikely that Hectorine earned much, as the family appeared not to have had more than a subsistence level of existence most of the time. In fact, Jessica commented that the family's survival was precarious, including irregular provision of food in the home. Jessica said that we lived by the grace of God, which would be the main factor in determining whether the children ate or not. So I've just selected there the idea that Jessica developed from an understanding from her mother that there were principles to be considered in life, whether or not she agreed with going without food. That's another thing. So another important value that Jessica learned from Hectorine was about community self-help, community self-reliance, and putting the needs of others first, making sacrifices. So this stemmed from Hectorine's faith and her beliefs about the importance of helping others before oneself. Okay, I'll read another extract. Basic supplies were limited. So we're talking about the 30s and the 40s. Basic supplies were limited, but Hectorine's second son, Monroe, had access through his work with American pilots during the war to the rare supplies that people in the yard wanted. When he went home to the yard, he would take large quantities of scarce supplies, such as sugar, rice, flour, and oil, to his mother. This precious stock was soon depleted as Hectorine was determined to share it with those in need in the yard, enlisting Jessica to participate in this process. And this is a quote from Jessica. My mother would get bottles and put some paper for everybody in the yard, and I had to take them to them. When Munro returned, wanting access to some of the supplies for a friend, he was incensed to find that it was all depleted. Jessica said, one day my brother Munro wanted some for a friend, and he was so angry with my mother. Mum, you can't give out everything like that. You can give yes, but don't give out all. For Hectorine, the act of giving was much more important and spiritually satisfying than possessing anything herself. And her daughter grew up with the same beliefs and practices. And this slide really looks at how Jessica developed her cultural understanding of being an African descended woman, and how some of that really came from her mother and was to continue to be a guiding principle throughout her life. And then, again, this is a quote from an extract from my book. Relief from life in the tenement yard came during the school holidays, when Jessica would be sent to spend time in the village of Mocha with her mother's best friend. This was an important aspect of growing up, an experience of which Jessica said, there's where I learned our culture, folk songs and so on. And I would come back down after the holidays and I would tell her and did a dance to show her. On her return, she would show Hectorine the kwekwe dances she had learned. Kwekwe is an African ceremony with traditional dance and music, normally associated with marriage. Estherine was a member of friendly and burial societies in British Guiana and inducted her daughter into participating in these movements. These organizations were established to ensure that poor people could afford to bury their dead with fitting cultural dignity through the collection of membership fees. The groups also funded and supported cultural activities, and Hectorine took Jessica with her to the annual meetings and conventions where she made an active contribution. Jessica would read poetry, read psalms from the Bible, sing and perform at these meetings, providing her with a strong cultural base during her childhood.
Just about head on, united against.
Okay. So during the 60s, the very end of 60s, late 60s, 68, 69, Jessica started a book service and publishing company operating from her home. And here I've got an extract in term just to set out her mindset in and her determination in getting her publishing project going. Jessica made the personal decision to become a full-time publisher. It was not planned as a corporate profit-making business venture. It was born out of a passionate resistance and anger about racialized injustices faced by Black people globally, and a sense that she wanted to take a major stand. And this is a quote from Jessica. A friend said to me that I'm doing it all the wrong way, that I should first of all set about the rules, have a feasibility study, and you must have your directors, you must have policy statements, and all the things that a big commercial venture would have. This is how they wanted us to start. And I said, no, we don't need all of that. People are going to buy your book once the book has some meaning to you. He said, I'd never do it my way. It's bound to fail. I said, not with my blood, it won't fail, you know. I will make certain it doesn't fail. After a period of operating the book service from family home, the bookshop was opened in Ealing in commercial premises, and I've managed to get hold of a picture of the opening day activities. There you can see Jessica with Gus John and Andrew Sorkey in the background. I don't know if anyone identifies the other person in the photograph. Okay, so I've got a quote there from the experience of Jessica's journey in terms of opening the bookshop with associates and colleagues with Eric. She overcame many hurdles on the journey to the birth of Bogle Overture Publications. The organising and editorial committee for the development of Groundings with My Brothers, was mostly all male, but she drew the women in, not just as typists, although many performed that role for the company in the early days, also as editors on the draft of Groundings, financial sponsors, and fundraisers. A greater hurdle was the bold confidence she needed to start a new Black publishing house, a mere 2 years after close friend John LaRose had founded his New Beacon Books. She was taking a bold step, not just to publish Groundings, but to talk about the necessity for another Black publisher that had a focus on Black history, Black heritage, and one that was more radical and rooted in the lives of Black people and workers. Jessica saw it as being about a new alternative in publishing, a hopeful cultural idea to become a living reality and a community example. She found the confidence to set this up alongside, not in competition with, John LaRose, a titanic figure of political and academic intellectualism at the time. I've got here a quote from Valerie Bloom and a couple of pictures which gives a sense of the bookshop. And Valerie Bloom obviously was published by Bogle Overture. And here she's just saying, I would go to the bookshop to do performances. She's referring to Jessica. I'd go to the bookshop to do performances. She used to put on performances every so often in the bookshop. And that was such an amazing situation because there were all these people who were legends who used to come to the bookshop, who would go to the bookshop and you'd be performing in front of them, rubbing shoulders with them, people like Gus John, Darcus Howe, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Keith Waite, and so on, who would also be performing, some of them. It was just an amazing, amazing time. And in mentioning Linton Kwesi Johnson, and really, obviously, we're aware that his first book, Dread, Beaten Blood, which was published in 1974, gave voice to a generation. So that's part of that quote. And Linton Kwesi Johnson described this work, that's Dread, Beaten Blood, as the book that established me as a poet in this country. I've been able to build upon that. My whole reputation was built around that book, and everything happened after that. And here, Linton Kwesi Johnson's talking about Jessica Huntley and Eric Huntley and the work they did together. And he's saying that they made a tremendous contribution to the Black radical movement and the Black liberation movement in this country. They provided the foundation for the information vacuum that was there before the intervention of New Beacon Books and then later on Bogle Overture. They provided the information, books on history, politics, culture, art, and so on, for the young and upcoming activists of that generation. They were role models, they were inspirational, they provided leadership, and Jessica was very much at the forefront of that. They've left a solid foundation of political and cultural activism for the next generation that came along to build upon. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Jessica and for Eric, for that matter. And my last slide is a tribute from friend of Bogle Overture, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote a tribute on Jessica's passing. Jessica Goes Home, and he wrote it in Gikuyu, and this is the English translation. Jessica goes home. After she completed her work on Earth, Jessica went home. At the gate, George Padmore and CLR James welcomed her. At the door, Walter Rodney and John LaRose greeted her. On entering, Maurice Bishop and Kwame Nkrumah hugged her. Enriam Giroux, Rosa Parks, and Tubman ovulated for a daughter come home to rest. This is your seat. You have joined the sacred council of spirits. May you protect the lives of Black people the world over and all the others tortured for seeking truth and justice. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, and just to say thank you very much for listening. And what I would add is that this is the second biography, that major biography that includes the life of Jessica Huntley. The first one was written by Dr. Margaret Andrews, and that was a joint biography which included an analysis of the life of and contribution of Eric Huntley. And this biography really focuses on Jessica Huntley, and I would say there are so many stories to be told about the life and work of Jessica Huntley and Eric Huntley, their associates, their family members, and at least 3 more books can be written, and I would encourage others to continue the research in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Claudia. That was really interesting. And I've got a long list of questions I'd love to ask you. But I'm going to wait, I think, until after Estherine Adams has done her talk. But I'm going to put my hands up. I know you can't see anybody else, but I just wanted to put my hands up in thanks and gratitude for just taking the time out today to deliver that talk. Also, simply because I know Uncle Eric just recently had his birthday. I think he's born 25th September.
Yes, so that's correct.
Yeah, just a few days ago. And
Uncle Eric. Chauncey.
And so, yeah, Chauncey had his birthday recently. Yeah. So, and I think Uncle Eric's online. Is he? I don't know. He was earlier.
Yeah, I saw.
Uncle Eric, either? Yeah, he is online. So I know, Uncle Eric, you'll be able to hear me. So just from everybody who's online, from myself and Rod at Guyana Speaks, wishing you a really, really happy birthday, and thanks and gratitude for all that you've done for the community. So thank you. But yeah, so
is Akabra there?
Akabra was trying to get online. I don't know if she managed to, but I know Uncle Eric managed to. So okay. I did send her the link.
We also have Waveney Bushell online.
Oh, hi, Waveney. Hi, hello. Thanks for joining us too. That's amazing. I hadn't spotted you on there because I know Rod's been letting everybody in, but yeah, wonderful to have you online. Thank you. And I'm just going to remove the pin from you, Claudia, so that I can now pin Dr. Estherine Adams. I'm just going to try and find her. Here we go. And I'll put a pin. There we go. Fantastic. Really great to see you online and to have you joining us from Guyana. Just to give you your introduction, I know everybody knows you're here to do a presentation, Encountering Guyanese Women in Wales, UK Research and Reconnections, I think it's the title. And Dr. Estherine Adams is a University of Guyana lecturer and head of the History and Caribbean Studies Department. Her research interests center on the 18th and 19th century Atlantic world, the British colonial Caribbean, Guyanese history, and the prisons in British Guiana, emphasizing women and gender. She has worked as a researcher on several projects, including the ESRC Global Challenges Research Grant Project, exploring mental, neurological, and substance abuse disorders in Guyana's jails from 1825 to the present day. She has published several articles and book chapters related to her research area. And she's also, amazingly, the winner of the 2023 Guyana Prize for Literature in the non-fiction category for her manuscript, The Few Among Many, Women's Labour in British Guyana's Jails, 1838 to 1917. I don't know when that's going to be published. Has it been published already, Estherine, or is it in manuscript form still?
It's under consideration for publication currently.
Okay, fantastic. So when it's ready for being published, do let us know so that we can spread the word. But meantime, over to you for the talk on Guyanese women in Wales. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, thank you for having me. Could you allow me to share?
Of course, yes, sorry. Let me do that now. So hold on a second. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. Now I'm doing all sorts of funny things on my screen. Okay, hold on a second. There we go. Yeah, you should be able to do that now.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I want to talk a little bit today about encountering Guyanese women in Wales in the United Kingdom. Now, when I arrived in Wales in July this year to spend some time at the Gladstone Archive to collect as many documents as I could relating to the colonial era and slavery in particular from that repository. Now, Miranda Kaufman, her generous offer to facilitate meetings with scholars proved invaluable for establishing connections. And when she asked me, who do you want to meet while you're there, I eagerly provided her a list, a very long list, I should say, of individuals I hope to meet, including several esteemed scholars of Guyanese descent. Regrettably, logistical constraints prevented me from connecting with most of them, including, of course, Juanita Cox. So my first encounter with a Guyanese woman in Wales was with the esteemed Charlotte Williams, a renowned writer, academic, and cultural critic. Now, as the daughter of the celebrated Guyanese painter, author, and archaeologist Dennis Williams, she embodied a rich legacy of artistic and intellectual brilliance. Now, over a shared dinner, we engaged in stimulating discussions about research, writing, and naturally, our shared heritage in Guyana. Now, during our conversation, Charlotte inquired about my discoveries in the archives that day, leading me to the second set of Guyanese women I encountered in Wales. Now, as I delved deeper into the historical records, I stumbled upon the stories of some remarkable women, their narratives compelling me to bring their experiences to light. Now, unlike Charlotte and Juanita, these women were no longer with us physically, but I still consider them Guyanese nonetheless, as they were enslaved in the land we now call Guyana for an extended period of time. Now, unlike my planned meeting with Charlotte, I encountered these women by chance. Now, during my research, I came across an entry called The Amours of Richard Elliot. Intrigued by the mention of Demerara, because I was basically looking for anything with a reference to Guyana. So anything that mentioned Demerara, Berbice, or Essequibo, I pursued it. I decided to see, what exactly were the amours of Richard Elliot. And I must be honest that I was not prepared for what I saw. The amours of Richard Elliot turned out to be a series of legal declarations detailing sexual violence perpetrated against a number of enslaved women. This is what I want to spend some time talking about today. So the second Guyanese woman I encountered in Wales was Nanette, an enslaved girl from Plantation Blankenberg on the west coast of Demerara. Nanette gave her testimony on the 16th of May, 1824, which appeared to be quite some time after the actual incident had taken place. She claimed that the incident occurred, quote, when Parson Elliot lived in Massa House, they had not begun to make chapel yet, unquote. Now, this detail allows us to narrow down the time of the incident, since further research has uncovered that Reverend Richard Elliot, a missionary of the London Missionary Society, arrived in the colony of British Guiana and was stationed at Plantation Larisilvanir on the east coast of Demerara in March of 1814. He was not transferred to the west coast of Demerara until the year 1817. Furthermore, the construction of the mission house and the chapel at the west coast station of the London Missionary Society mission completed sometime around 1819. So this suggests that the assault against Nanette occurred sometime between 1817 and 1819. Nanette, in her testimony, stated that she was, quote, a little girl minding fowls close to the plantation house when one day Parson Elliot, quote, call me come close him, he won't forgive me one spelling book, end of quote. So she initially resisted, saying that, quote, I tell him I not want book, I can't go close him, end of quote. Reverend Elliot persisted and eventually coerced the child to sleep with him, quote unquote, paying her $2 afterwards. Elliot slept with Nanette at least on one other occasion before her mother, Christina, the third Guyanese woman I encountered, found out and punished Nanette. Now, Christina testified that she heard people talking that Nanette, quote, half Parson Elliot. She confronted her daughter, who admitted everything. She said she, quote, quarreled with her and licked her because Reverend Elliot already had a white wife, and therefore Nanette should not, in Christina's words, have him. The fourth woman was Sarah, another enslaved woman from Plantation Blankenburg, who testified that Reverend Elliot sexually assaulted her. Sarah's case is a bit more poignant because of the details that emerged. She recalled that after the first incident occurred sometime around 1819, a time when she did not live with her mother, but with her aunt Mimba, and when she was young, as she told Massa, quote, as she told Reverend Elliot, quote, Massa, me no big yet. According to her, one Saturday night, several young people, most likely children, from the plantation attended chapel for catechism with Reverend Elliot. Now, at the end of the session, Elliot ordered her to empty the chamber pot from his chamber, which was located above the chapel. Now, upon completing the task and preparing to leave the chamber, Elliot grabbed Sarah's hand and told her to stay because he had a story to tell her. Now, the child protested vehemently, pointing out her youth and innocence and the possibilities of punishment from her parents should they find out what happened, if anything happened to her. She recalls how she pleaded with him, quote, I tell Parson say, Massa, me no big yet. You shall spoil me. Make me mother and father know, then they select me. I never been have man before. I can swear and kiss the Bible. I know being big yet myself, and my breasts have not been come out yet. And I know being have Miss Nancy for a long time enough. End of quote. Elliot, ignoring the child's pleadings, sexually assaulted her, and as with Nanette, he gave her $2, presumably for her silence. He initially gave her the same $2. Okay, let me go that again. He initially gave her $2, but then reconsidering, he took back $1, saying that the possibility of her mother finding out was greater if he gave her, quote, plenty money. He then encouraged Sarah to return to the chapel every Saturday and to, quote, go close to him. She admitted that she did return the following Saturday, but after Elliot only gave her 1 guilder, she never returned. Sarah notes that Mimba, the woman she lived with, became suspicious of her and threatened to search her because, quote, she believed I must have man, end of quote. Sarah became afraid and ran away from Mimba's house because back to live with her mother. Now, Mimba, the next woman I encountered, corroborates the fact that Sarah was indeed a child who had not had her, quote, course, referring to her menstrual cycle as yet. She remembered clearly the time she accused Sarah of being sexually active and threatened to search her. Now, this was not because she heard rumors about Reverend Elliot and Sarah, but because of the changes she observed in Sarah's behavior. Mimba claims that Sarah had, quote, been very lazy for some time and not want to do any work for her. It was after Sarah ran back to her mother's house that Mimba began hearing people talk about Elliot and Sarah. Shocked, Member confronted Sarah, who confessed that Elliot had what Elliot had done to her. Now, according to Member, Sarah said, quote, "I can't help, Auntie. Parson hold me, carry me in his chamber, go take my maidenhead," end of quote. Now, after reading Sarah's story, I had to take a break from the archives. While I was intrigued, I struggled with the emotional impact of the violence inherent in these documents. Even though I recognize that working with these types of documents is an emotional endeavor, one that researchers of these types of history have to be open to feeling and learning to cope with. On my return to the archives later that day, I encountered Hannah through the testimony of two enslaved men, because at the time of the deposition, which was taken in 1824, Hannah was not alive. She appeared to have died in 1823. Now, her story was told through the eyes of her ex-husband, Isaac, and another enslaved man called John, who had been brought to the colony from Sandomang. John's declaration stated that during his time as a domestic, presumably in the Great House, he witnessed Reverend Elliot put his hands on Hannah's neck and breasts. He also claimed that Hannah often visited Elliot's chapel late at night to pray at what he called, or what he described as cross meetings, and he never saw her leave until the following morning. Isaac, on the other hand, testified that he saw Elliot go to Hannah's house on many occasions after dark, although he made it clear that he could not testify about what happened behind Hannah's closed doors. He also recalled that around 1819, a time when Mrs. Elliot went to England, he saw Hannah, quote, "many times walk the road between Chapel and Blankenberg, come home before daylight in the morning," end of quote. It is not clear if these incidents occurred before, during, or after Hannah and Isaac's marriage, as he also notes that, quote, "he left her because she was not good to boil the pot for me, and not referring in any way to the sexual relation between Elliot and Hannah." It is evident Elliot's sexual assault against these enslaved women was not limited to those on Plantation Blankenberg, as the other cases show. There were accusers from Plantation Anna Catharina, Plantation Union, Plantation Rotterdam, Plantation Edinburgh, Plantation Groeneveld, Plantation Hoosterdaren, and Plantation Good Success on Wakenham. For diverse reasons, including the planters' aversion to any form of Christianization among the enslaved people, there were very few missionaries working among them. Consequently, one missionary was often responsible for an entire area of the colony. For instance, after Reverend John Ray was transferred to Berbice, Reverend John Smith replaced him as the missionary for the east coast of Demerara. And so all the enslaved people from the east coast who were interested in Christianity, they gathered at Bethel Chapel. Similarly, once Elliot was sent to west coast of Demerara, it appears that the entire west coast, as well as the Essequibo coast and the Essequibo Islands, were under his jurisdiction. So Elliot would have traveled to these areas as part of his mission to proselytize for the London Missionary Society. He did not, however, have to travel very far to meet Dolly of Plantation Anna Catharina, who was the next Guyanese woman that I encountered. Dolly's ordeal began when she was returning from Tongue, possibly Georgetown, due to an illness. Her master sent Wren, most likely an enslaved man, to accompany her and to carry her things. Dolly recalls that she encouraged Wren to go ahead with her things, as she was not well enough to keep up with him. Dolly's slow trek eventually brought her to Elliot's chapel, where she heard someone call, quote, "Sister, sister." Dolly looked up and saw Reverend Elliot, who invited her to shelter in the unfurnished chapel as it was raining. She explained that she could not climb the ladder to access the unfurnished they finished upstairs of the building because she was ill with a fever. Reverend Elliot offered her a hand up the ladder and some porter and wine once she was situated. She refused both alcoholic offerings owing to her illness. Dolly declared that Elliot placed his hand on her breast, remarking, quote, "You have good breasts. You ever had a child?" Realizing what was happening, Dolly inquired of him if the reason he called her was to have sex with her. "Quote, I tell him," she said, "Massa, that for this make you call me? You know, see, I have fever." Elliot, clearly disregarding her plight, said, quote, that's nothing, quote. He then drew her down, in her words, and had her. She was so traumatized by what had taken place that she, quote, sat down 1 good hour after that. There were 10 other enslaved girls who were scheduled to be deposed in the case against Reverend Elliot. There were Sylvia, Domingo, Becky, Minty, Palas, Jabba, and 4 other girls whose names were not listed, including the waiting maid of one Mrs. Campbell. Now, my encounter with these Guyanese women at the Gladstone Archives in Wales unearthed more questions than answers, which completely changed the trajectory of my research project. Now, the foremost question was, who was Reverend Elliot? And why were these depositions occurring at this particular time? In other words, what triggered this series of events? What I have uncovered thus far, and this is a work in progress, as a matter of fact, this invitation to speak at this forum is what really, encouraged me to go on with the research, because I had set it aside. It was too heavy for me, but I really wanted to talk about something that was linked to the UK, and so that really persuaded me to continue on this path. But what I have uncovered thus far is the making of an intricate story of the state, slavery, sexual assault, and salvation. Born in 1776, Richard Elliot studied at Gosport, Hampshire, in the southeast of England, before he was ordained at Fetter Lane Chapel in London, and then appointed to Tobago after his ordination. Elliot set sail for Tobago on February 12th, 1808, and arrived on April 11th, 1808. Mrs. Elliot, she left after him and arrived at Tobago on the 24th of January in 1809. Now, the Elliots were removed from Tobago, and interestingly enough, I have not uncovered as yet any reason for, why they were removed from Tobago, which of course suggests that perhaps something similar to what happened on the west coast of Demerara probably happened in Tobago. But he was removed from Tobago and he was sent to Le Souvenir in Demerara in March of 1814. Afterwards, he preached in Georgetown, and in 1817 he was sent to the West Coast station. In 1819, Mrs. Elliot left Demerara sometime around October because of ill health, and she arrived in England around the 25th of December. In 1819, Mr. Elliot, from the proceeds of the sale of the mission house and the chapel in Tobago, he built a mission house at Plantation La Jealousy at the West Coast Station, and he used the lower part of the house that he built for as a chapel. Now, Reverend Richard Elliot, if you search his name, he's credited with starting the missionary work at the Ebenezer Congregational Church on the west coast of Demerara, and he's highly revered among Congregationalists across there. The Ebenezer Congregational Church was the most influential and instrumental in molding the character of a lot of the early villagers in the post-slavery era. Children who were born in that community are oftentimes referred to as an Ebenezer boy or an Ebenezer girl. So, I mean, he has, you know, in the eyes of the people there, he is somebody to be revered. Now, the insurrection of the enslaved people in 1823, because the second question that I asked, you know, is why this thing was happening at the time that it did, when clearly these events took place at least 10 years earlier. So it seems as though the insurrection, the 1823 insurrection, was the catalyst for the Inquisition of Reverend Elliot. Now, at the outbreak of the revolt, and this was quite surprising for me, he was arrested and taken to Georgetown, where he was confined in the Dutch Reformed Church, which had been turned into a barracks. Now, he was eventually forced to leave the colony, and he returned to England, arriving in London on February 13, 1824. And his connection with the London Missionary Society was severed on the 14th of March, 1825. Now, like I said, making this connection was shocking, as the reports of the rebellion always focused, and perhaps rightly so, on Reverend John Smith and the events surrounding him. To date, I have not found any other source of the rebellion, contemporary or otherwise, that has mentioned Reverend Richard Elliot. So why was he arrested? All right, was it because of his connection to John Smith? Because he had spent some time at Le Souvenir when he initially arrived in the colony? If that were the case, then why wasn't Reverend John Ray arrested and detained as well? Because he would have had a lot of interaction with John Smith as well. So was the inquiry conducted only to justify Elliot's arrest and detention? Were the voices of these abused and enslaved girls only relevant when they could be exploited to further the ends of their European overlords? Uncovering these cases, filed under the amours of Reverend Elliot, pressed me to think more deeply about the character of the colonial archive. Black feminist scholars in particular have reflected on how the archives silence Black voices and normalizes violence done to Black bodies. In Saidiya Hartman's famous formulation, the slavery archives is, quote, a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life, an asterisk in the grand narrative of history. Jennifer Morgan notes that the victims of slavery, quote, disappeared from merchant ledgers, planters' inventories, and modern databases, end of quote, and that these are particular problems with the, quote, archival silences around the lived experiences of enslaved women. Hazel, end of quote. Hazel Carby has written eloquently of her own encounter and argues, quote, human beings who lived and breathed were confined within the straitjackets of columns and bound within ledgers, end of quote. These critics make powerful interventions, and they rightly foster a sense of suspicion towards colonial archives. As academics, observes Carberry, quote, we sit in archives and stare at these records, each carefully rendered in measured and elegant script, and we are prone to forget, quote, the terror and violence camouflaged by this cosmetic beauty, end of quote. For the most part, colonial archives hide the terror and violence of plantation slavery, but ever so often we come across fragments like those I've talked about today that brings this terror and violence into stark relief. So I practice naming the enslaved when I encounter them to make it possible to identify and recognize individual persons, to trace them across different sources, and to recover what we can of their lives. My encounter with these Guyanese women in Wales, both the living and the dead, unearthed more questions and answers, and completely changed the trajectory of my research project. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Estherine. That was amazing. I wasn't expecting any of that. Which is, I don't know what I thought you were going to encounter in your research in Wales, but I certainly wasn't, expecting to hear, certainly not the story of a reverend committing so much just hideous abuse of women. So I guess what I'm gonna, well, first of all, I'm gonna put my hands together for you because I know you can't see the others. So just to say thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And I'm gonna pin both you and let me just get Claudia back up. And then we'll go to a kind of a Q&A. Claudia should be here. Add pin. There we go. Got the two of you. That's perfect. So I'm just going to see first if there are any particular questions in the chat. Yeah, so we've got one from Professor Lewis, Lyndon Lewis, who says, and this is a question for you, Claudia, could you elaborate on the relationship between Jessica Huntley and the PPP in the formative years of that political organization? Also, what was the nature of the relationship between Jessica and the other Pan-Africanists such as George Padmore? So there's two questions really there.
Thank you. So from the late 1940s, probably from the mid-40s when Cheddi Jagan returned from his dental training in the USA. And at that time, through the end of the 1940s, was British Guiana saw an upsurge in anti-colonial activism. There has always been an element of resistance to the colonial activity in British Guiana, but that really intensified in the late 1940s. And Jessica Huntley, as a young woman at that time, who was also involved in trade union activities, and the influence of her mother and her friends. And then she formed a partnership with Eric Huntley also, who together they became part of the forerunner of the PPP, the early People's Progressive Party, which at that time was very different from the PPP today. It was very much a workers' party, which was very broad-based and really intended to focus on meeting the building the rights of all workers. There was no factionalism within the PPP, and Jessica Huntley was a grassroots campaigner, particularly within women's activism, and she was a founding member of the PPP, with alongside comrades such as UC Quayana, who contributed to this research, and yes, and so I think generally her activities were during the period when the PPP came to power in April 1953 and then was overturned in October 1953. There was a very, very, very cold political climate, and Jessica Huntley and the WPO, my research showed that play a very important role in keeping the resistance going against against colonialism at the time, and they were responsible for clandestine political activities in terms of ensuring the spread of and sharing of banned political literature, which was banned by the British government in Guyana, and people were not able to associate with each other. So she played so she was a grassroots activist, and she's also been credited with helping to rebuild the PPP during that 1953 to 1958 period, when there were emergency regulations in Guyana. And the second question was, can you just remind me?
Yeah, it was what was the nature of the relationship between Jessica and other Pan-Africanists such as George Padmore?
Jessica, I don't have any record of Jessica Huntley meeting George Padmore. However, she was a close associate of CLR James, and many other activists who eventually went on to become the leaders of the new independence movements in the Caribbean. So I think it does depend on how one defines Pan-Africanism. I'm defining Pan-Africanism in the broadest sense. Her outlook and perspectives and activities were Pan-African. So that's how I would answer those two questions, really.
Fantastic. I've got some questions for you, but I'm gonna turn to Estherine. We'll do this in turn. So I just wanted to read you the comments by Vimal Tamari, and he just says, "Thank you, Estherine. A very shocking story, and good that you could bring this into light and help to acknowledge the suffering of these women. Also seeing the impact on you of their trauma." He's just saying, look after yourself, which, yeah, I think we'll all extend the same wishes to you, because I know it's really difficult, especially when you're spending day in and day out with resources like that. But the question that comes from Yvonne Griffin is, where in Wales did you get the information you've shared with us? And that kind of connects to a question I had, which was really, what drew you to the resources in Wales? I mean, how did you know? Was there something that kind of signposted that it might be full of really interesting material? And kind of connected to that, you mentioned that the uprising of 1823 appeared to be some sort of catalyst to him being exposed. But I'm just wondering how does it get exposed? I mean, I guess it's all about who was involved in the uprising. So how does it come to him, and why he's doing all this abuse to these women? Sorry, that's three questions really, but
thank you for your well wishes. We're in Wales. This I just found this at the Gladstone library in is it Hawarden? In Hawarden, Wales. And when I started, because like you said earlier when you were introducing me, my interest is really in incarcerated women. And what really drew me there was the fact that it was Gladstone's papers, and Gladstone owned that plantation Success, which the rebellion started on. And the other work that I did, I knew that a number of women had been incarcerated during the course of the rebellion. So what I was really hoping for was, that I can find some kind of record there that would perhaps name these women, say when they were incarcerated. Unfortunately, I was able to find a list of all of the incarcerated people from Gladstone's plantation that were incarcerated during the course of the 1823 rebellion. But then, like I said, as I was going through the catalog, trying to, because I'm like, as I'm here, let me just collect. That's all I wanted to do, just collect as much as I can, because you don't often get the kind of opportunities to visit these places, because of course it's quite expensive to do so coming from Guyana. And so what I wanted to do is just collect every single thing that I could that mentioned Guyana in any way, shape, or form. And that really is, just going through, and it's like the amours of Reverend Elliot. Like, what are the amours? Because sounds like some love, some things. I'm just thinking, oh, maybe he wrote some poem or something. But then it mentions Demerara, so it's like, you know what? It mentions Demerara. Let's just see what it is. And I tell you, I was not prepared in any way, shape, or form for what I actually read there, right? So it wasn't something that I was looking for. All right, it just like literally, I just ran into this document, and it was not, it were just those documents that you saw there. Basically, that was the entirety of this of this collection. There were like two others, but they were two enslaved men, based, just corroborating what the authors were saying. They saw this and they saw that, and I didn't include that. So those maybe 5 documents that I displayed there with the additional 2, literally that is everything that I found there. And again, like you're asking me, what caused this? And I honestly don't know why at that particular time. I'm just assuming that it had something to do with, with the 1823 rebellion, because why? This is 1824, this is happening. All right. And then when I started moving backwards, because I looked at the dates on the documents, and I see this is 1824. So I said, you know what, let me go to the minutes of the Court of Policy, because if there's anything major happening, it's going to be in the minutes of the Court of Policy. So I started, when I came back to Guyana, I went to the archives, and I got the minutes of the Court of Policy for 1824, the same around the date that these declarations were taken. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to work backwards from 1824 and see what I find. And that is where I found reference to his arrest during at the outbreak of the rebellion. So that, so I'm saying, it had to be there must have been some kind of connection with this rebellion and these events, because these events that these women are these girls are chronicling are things that happened since in the 1819, and clearly a lot of people knew what was happening, and nobody was interested in pursuing it at that time. So why no? And that is where I am as well. So I all of that to say that I'll let you know when I find out.
Right. So I was just curious, because I think you said that his wife left in 1819. Were these cases happening before she left or after she left?
The only one, well, the case with Nanette, the very first girl, right? Because I was able to narrow it down between 1817 and 1890. So I am not, again, quite sure when exactly it happened, but most of the others reference her leaving as a signpost, to date when this event occurred. Right? So it seems though most of the other instances occurred perhaps after she left, but the one with but Nanette's case, because her mother was saying he has a wife, and possibly the wife is there, but we don't know. But that's where I am.
Yeah, very kind of very intriguing, because you wonder how it would have impacted the dynamics between those women and his wife, and also whether maybe that prompted her leaving. So she left because she was ill, but yeah, there's a lot to be found out there. But also I was interested that you said that he had set up the Ebenezer Congregational Church, because I know I've spoken to some of the women here in the UK, including Auntie Joyce Trotman, and she always said that the Congregational Church in Georgetown was huge. It played such a major role in the lives of Black people in Georgetown. And as you say, he was placed on a pedestal, so it's kind of interesting to then hear this backstory. But I just wanted to come back, Claudia, to you to ask a question, following up a little bit on what Professor Linden had mentioned. Not so much to do with George Padmore, but I guess I was sort of interested in what role, or if you were able to establish the extent to which Jessica's work with publishing was really important in terms of kind of transnational activism. You were talking a little bit like the publication of Groundings, Walter Rodney's Groundings, and I'm wondering you know, how that went on to influence activism, you know, within the UK, but beyond the UK.
Yes. So just to say a little more about CLR James. So obviously Bogle Overture is associated with, in terms of its early publications, associated with publishing the works of Walter Rodney, but some of the first, prior to publishing Groundings, the speeches of CLR James were amongst the earliest publications, and those publications were the making of the Caribbean people. So and Black Power. So those were two early speeches of CLR James that he made in 67 and 68. And the reason for publishing them was to ensure that they were widely available. As we know, once speeches are disseminated, unless they're published, no one really gets to hear them. But so Bogle Overture played an important role in ensuring that those materials were available for dissemination and distribution globally. And I think, and later on, that was very much the approach and the stance taken by, adopted by Bogle Overture publications. It's interesting because I think when we think about publishing houses nowadays and the way publishing companies work, and the fact that they are that they have a strategy. So Bogle Overture did have a strategy of publishing Black ideas of relevance and interest to Black people globally. They didn't seek books and manuscripts, so these came and were presented to Bogle Overture. And if you think about Groundings with My Brothers and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, so those were globally important, and particularly with Groundings was widely viewed, and it's still viewed as being the foundational text of Black Power in the Caribbean, the USA. Obviously, Walter Rodney was known in those areas, and the associates of some of the founding members of Bogle Overture were students. So many of the activists and were students and workers who were in Britain for a period of time, who helped to establish Bogle Overture. And then they went, they traveled to the USA, to America, and so those ideas were international. In terms of what Bogle Overture subsequently went on to publish, its authors were in the Caribbean, in Britain, in the USA, and so when I was seeking to interview many of the participants, my interviews were international. Yeah, so I don't know if that's helpfully if that's helpful in answering your question.
Yeah, it does.
I know it's a little bit.
It does, yeah. It certainly points to having been strongly influential. I wanted to just bring up, Rod has just reminded me, we've got 5 minutes or so to go.
Question for me, actually.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring in David Chung's question, and he says, could you explore ways in which Jessica's life's work informs the present and future of people of African heritage going forward? I think that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, what do we take from? Yeah, what do we take?
It is a great question, and one in which during the course of my PhD research, advice I received either promoted looking at that or resisted looking at that, because one, it's a very important question, and and several of the participants, my interview participants, did actually give voice to that, particularly when we were, my research was that Black Lives Matters, George Floyd, all of that was actually happening as a backdrop to my research, which started in 2020. And so I can only really point to what Jessica herself said about the future, because as you can imagine, she was frequently asked about that and about future generations, because she was in her 40s when she started working with Bogle Overture and these students. So so she was already viewed as an elder when she was starting out, and people were seeking advice and words of wisdom from her for the future. And she so what I can say is that she said that future generations of African descended people, Black people, will there will always be a need to organize, unify, and resist. So it was her view that she was pleased initiatives such as the election of the first Black MPs and initiatives to get more Black police officers on board, but she didn't accept that those would yield fundamental changes, and she felt that that going forward, unity, organization, protected spaces, and alliances alongside protected spaces would be the future. And I think that's all I can say. I think that's in terms of that question, which is a great question. I think that's something to that we can all think about and reflect on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think if we'd had all of that in place, maybe we would have been more prepared when the Windrush scandal happened. I think there's a lot more organization, but maybe a lot more oversight as well, like having members of the community who are kind of aware of what's going on within government and in what ways those things are impacting the community. So and definitely I like what you were saying about protected spaces as well. I think that's really important. And the alliances. So unity, what was the other one? Resistance, organization.
Unity, yes, unity, organization, and resistance would be part of the future work that Black people needed to do, people of African heritage, the diaspora. She very much felt that the story wasn't over.
No,
as there is a narrative that we are in a post-racial era now, but she's never accepted that. Yeah.
No, I get that. So I forgot to ask when your book is out. I can't remember if it's out already or you're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, it's out next Thursday, but there are a few advance copies available. Yeah, so it's out next Thursday.
Next Thursday. And where can they get it from?
It's available. I'm not sure which bookshops as yet will be stocking it. I think New Beacon Books probably will, but it's still early days yet.
Still early days.
But
okay, well,
yeah,
definitely
available to order online.
Yeah,
available to order online.
Okay, fantastic. Well, congratulations on that and on getting your PhD as well. And it's coming to 5, so I think we'll close there in terms of any questions. Estherine, thank you so much. Sounds like there's a lot of research to be done, and honestly, if we'd had more time, I had a burning question about whether Reverend Elliot appeared anywhere in kind of the media, any media records of him and what he'd done, which presumably it was all hidden away, as you kind of inferred in terms of how colonial texts kind of hide the violence as much as possible of the kind of history of slavery. But yeah, definitely intrigued. And so thank you so much for joining us from Guyana. Thank you, Claudia. I don't know, Uncle Eric, if you're online, whether you want to have a final word before we go. Uncle Eric, are you there? I know you're there with, I think you're there with Akabra. So if you're online and you wanted to say anything, let us know. Otherwise I shall close. Uncle Eric?
Hi, this is Beverly. Hello.
Oh, hi, Beverly. Oh, thanks for joining us.
Not at all. Great session. Thank you so much, Claudia. Uncle Eric's indisposed at the moment, but thank you very much for a really in-depth, rewarding, and I mean, so interesting, the stories. Really fantastic today. So thank you, Claudia. You've done a great honor to the story of Mother Jessica. Thank you so much. Really, really.
Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly. Yeah, I would open it up, but yeah, I'm really sorry. We're stuck for time. Normally we finish at like 5:30, but Rod and I have gotten another engagement to go to, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have opened it up for a bit longer. But yeah, thank you so much to everyone that joined us today. I'd put in the chat the events that are coming up, but they'll also be available on the Facebook page and on Twitter. So, and obviously I'll update anybody on our usual circular. So we'll see you again in October. But for now, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you later. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.